chapter 17. And we're going to begin in verse 29. I'm going to speak this morning on finding a cause. Finding a cause. When David was on his way to, in obedience to his father, to check on his brothers and to bring a care package to them, he didn't anticipate any of the rest of the story in chapter 17. But he found a cause. And as believers, it's more than a worldly cause. I'm not saying that you can't give to charitable organizations, but as believers, we have a spiritual cause. We have a reason that we are here. And God imposes or encourages us and reveals to us at times in our life specific things He wants only us to do because of where we live, because of who we are around. And He chooses sometimes the least likely people who nobody else would ever think would do it. The Bible says not many noble, not many mighty are chosen. And so it says God hath chosen the foolish things of this world to confound the wise. And so sometimes in our Christian life, we may, I don't want to say be blindsided, because David was a young man who walked with God, and we should be walking with God. But we might be surprised at what the Lord may create as an opportunity for us. This cause that David had did not all of a sudden pop up in his mind as far as a decision to go with it. David was a young man who walked with God. He tended his father's sheep. Many of the Psalms that we read, I love the Psalms, this is my favorite book of the Bible. He wrote as a shepherd. He wrote in his quiet times. I often picture David laying in a pasture, laying in tall grass. I was raised on a farm. We had some alfalfa. And that's kind of comfortable, actually. He wrote about the stars, which tells me that if he was laying down, looking up at the stars, in amazement and wonder, he wrote Psalm 8, either whether he was standing or whether he was laying down, but he spent a lot of time alone. And tending his father's sheep was not without dangers. If you read prior chapters, you'll find that David at one point was confronted with a bear. At another point, he was confronted with a lion. And that comes up in the story as he answers Saul. He was a young man who, again, nobody really even thought of in Israel as rising to where he did in so quickly a time. And not that we are going to rise to heights of greatness. It's not at all why David did what he did. David was the same as a young man and when he was by himself as he was in every stage of his life. Now, he made mistakes, and we've read about those mistakes. But God used David in a great way. And it started as a young man. There's a tendency in life for people to discount those who are quiet, those who are thinkers, and in our society, those who are spiritual. David was all three. David wasn't a limelight person. Most of his time as a young man was spent, once he got old enough to do it, was spent tending his father's sheep. I'll be honest, that would be a boring job. Okay? For two reasons. The Bible is very clear that sheep are very dumb animals, not that they can't speak. Okay? We didn't raise sheep. My cousins raised sheep, and I've been around them long enough. Yeah, they're dumb animals. Okay? But there was no conversation. He's not going to be engaging. I mean, all they could say was "bah." Okay? And there's no. It's he and the sheep. And so as he is out there, all he has is time. All he has is God. The sheer distance from where they live, because shepherds move their sheep, would be such that if there was danger, he couldn't just get on the cell phone and say, "Hey, Dad, run up here with the four-wheeler. I've got some wolves out here. I've got a lion here. I've got a bear here. I've got, there's trouble here." He didn't have that luxury. And his dependence was on the Lord. He learned at a very young age where his dependence was. And God used him to do something in his nation that was astounding. So let's start in chapter 16, and let's see his rise. Let's see the development of the cause unfolding. In chapter 16, and beginning in verse number 4, it says, "And Samuel did that which the Lord spake, and came to Bethlehem. And the elders of the town, trembling at his coming, said, Comest thou peaceably? And he said, Peaceably, I am come to sacrifice unto the Lord. Sanctify yourselves, and come with me to the sacrifice. And he sanctified Jesse his sons, and called them to the sacrifice. And it came to pass, when they were come, that he looked on Eliab, and said, Surely the Lord's anointed is before him." Now, here again is something that you need to understand about God. God is not concerned about your appearance physically. By that meaning, that is a qualification. It's not choosing necessarily the strongest. It's not choosing necessarily the one of the most beauty, the best looking. Although David, the Bible talks about him being a good looking young man, his stature was shorter. His physique would have been smaller. He was the youngest. And so usually the youngest is always put down by the oldest. Julianne is our youngest. For those of you who don't know, we have 5 children. And as our kids got older and from their perspective wiser, and they had so much more wisdom and information to share with their parents on how we were to do things as they were growing up. And by the way, parents, that doesn't stop. Just as late as yesterday, and I won't go into it, but I was given some more formal advice from one of my children. And I took it under advisement. I'm still thinking about it. And it would involve somewhat of a change in my personality, and I don't know that I want to change it. But anyway, so I'm just saying. But we were told, especially as our children that were teenagers were getting to the point where they were out of the house, Julianne, when she's 16, is going to have her own car. And then when she graduates, she's going to have her own TV in her room at 16. When she graduates, she's going to get her own car. And that didn't happen, okay? But that was a perspective. And so David was a young man who, if you will, was forgotten. And you'll see that here. God tells Samuel, go to Bethlehem, and there's a young man there that I have chosen to be the next king. And the first one he sees is Eliab, and he says, surely this is the Lord's choice. And the Lord said, no. The Lord said unto Samuel, look not on his countenance or on the height of his stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord seeth not as man seeth, for man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on the heart. Verse 8 says, then Jesse called Abinadab and made him pass before Samuel. And he said, neither hath the Lord chosen this. Then Jesse made Shammah to pass by, and he said, neither hath the Lord chosen this. And Jesse made 7 of his sons to pass before Samuel. And Samuel said unto the Lord hath not chosen these. Now listen to what he says in verse 11. And Samuel said unto Jesse, are here all thy children? And he said, there remaineth yet the youngest, and behold, he keepeth the sheep. And Samuel said unto Jesse, send and fetch him, for we will not sit down till he come hither. Why not get a servant? Why not bring all your sons at one time and get one of your servants to... And I mean, maybe they were poor. Maybe they didn't. Maybe all the servants were just the family. I don't know. But the issue was, God said, go get him. How sad that David wasn't even considered. He wasn't even an option. And the moment he came in the presence of Samuel, God says, that's him. Anoint him. Fast forwarding in the story to chapter 17, David is not considered. He is forgotten. Verse 1 of chapter 17 says, and actually, let's go to verse 19. When David is anointed, David is brought before Saul. And if you look at what Saul made him, it's interesting. Wherefore Saul sent messengers unto Jesse and said, send me David thy son, which is with a sheep. And Jesse took an ass laden with bread and a bottle of wine and a kid, and sent them by David his son unto Saul. And David came to Saul and stood before him, and he loved him greatly. And he became his armor bearer. That was a very significant position, because he was first line to the king. He was the one who was right there in battle beside the king. And so verse 21 says, and David came to Saul and stood before him, and he loved him greatly, and he became his armor bearer. And Saul sent to Jesse, saying, let David, I pray thee, stand before me, for he hath found favor in my sight. And it came to pass, when the evil spirit from God was upon Saul, that David took an harp and played with his hand. So Saul was refreshed and was well, and the evil spirit departed from him. So interesting that David initially becomes the armor bearer, and he soothes Saul with his harp, and then later on, as he becomes king and Saul becomes jealous, then Saul runs him out of the palace and then goes after him to the ends of the earth. David was beginning to rise. And I'm sure that, well, think about it, there's a great step up, okay? Going from the sheepfolds to the palace and now being placed in a position as the armor bearer of the king was significant. But his brothers still thought he was nothing. They were much like Joseph's brothers, who didn't like Joseph because of his spirituality was accentuated. And Joseph didn't talk about it. His brothers thumped him for it. And so David is just following the open doors that God has placed before him and is not looking for it. God is blessing his life. In chapter 17, verse 1, that says, "Now the Philistines gathered together their armies to battle, and were gathered together at Shokuk, which belongeth to Judah, and pitched between Shokuk and Azekah and Ephes-dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together and pitched in by the valley of Elah, and set the battle in array against the Philistines." Now, this doesn't sound like a big deal initially because Israel battled enemies all the time. Verse 2. "And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together and pitched by the valley of Elah." And verse 3, "And the Philistines stood on a mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side, and there was a valley between them." So that's the setting. So you can picture in your mind. "And there went out a champion out of the camp of the Philistines, named Goliath, of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits. That's a cubit is 1.5 feet, so 18 inches. So 6 times 18 inches is 6 feet, and then half of that is 9 feet, 3 more feet, and a span, which is about 6 inches. So 6 times 6 inches is 36. That's another, how much? 18. That's 18 inches. So that means he was about roughly 10'8", maybe pushing 11 feet. That's a big man, okay? So Israel is all, they're all looking down into this valley from this mountain. And the Philistines are looking down, and they send Goliath out into that valley. And he challenges and defies Israel to try to defeat him. This is a big deal. And verse 6 says he had greaves of brass upon his legs and a target of brass between his shoulders, and the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam. And his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and one bearing a shield went before him. This man was an imposing figure. And he stood and cried unto the armies of Israel, and said unto them, "Why are ye come out to set your battle in array? Am not I a Philistine, and ye servants to Saul? Choose you a man for you, and let him come down to me. If he be able to fight with me and to kill me, then will we be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then shall ye be our servants and serve us." And the Philistines said, "I defy the armies of Israel this day." Or the Philistine, Goliath himself, said, "I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now, when the king first and all the armies of Israel are dismayed, are perplexed and depressed and fearful, that's a bad thing. That's a really bad thing. So all this is going on. Jesse is not privy to this, David's father. He sends David up simply just to check on his brothers. And in verse number 12. It says, "Now David was the son of that Ephrathite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse. And he had 8 sons, David being the youngest. And the man went among them, went among men for an old man in the days of Saul. And the 3 eldest sons of Jesse went and followed Saul to the battle." So 3 of his brothers were there. "And the names of his 3 sons that went to the battle were Eliab the firstborn, and next unto him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. And David was the youngest, and the 3 eldest followed Saul. But David went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep." Remember, now he's the armor bearer. He's every once in a while when Saul's having one of these demon oppressions, David plays for him and soothes him. And it says, and the Philistine drew near morning and evening and presented himself 40 days. So this wasn't just a one-day deal. And that's the impression we get. Okay, he comes out there, he challenges them, and then and David goes out, knocks him, knocks him down, and no, this went on for 40 days, over a month, and it's taxing on Israel. "And Jesse said unto David, his son, Take now for thy brethren an ephah of this parched corn, and these 10 loaves, and run to the camp to thy brethren, and carry these 10 cheeses unto the captain of their 1,000, and look how thy brethren fare, and take their pledge." So, it's just information. That's all. David he has no other agenda, has no other reason. But David is misunderstood. People that are forgotten and people that are misunderstood are often written off by people in the fact that they could ever do anything for God. God can do anything with anybody he chooses to. And so, if you feel that way, forgotten, or you feel left out, or feel misunderstood, don't discount what God can do in your life. In verse 20, David rose up early in the morning. This is chapter 17 again of 1 Samuel. "And left the sheep with a keeper, and took," see, there's a keeper, right? So could his dad have gotten a helper? Yeah. All his brothers weren't tending the sheep, okay? David was the one who tended the sheep because he was the youngest, and maybe that was the job that was just passed down till he was the last one, and so he's the brunt of everybody. "He took and went as Jesse had commanded him, and he came to the trench as the host was going forth to the fight, and shouted for the battle. For Israel and the Philistines had put the battle in array, army against army. And David left his carriage in the hand of the keeper of the carriage, and ran into the army, and came and saluted his brethren. And as he talked with them, behold, there came up the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, out of the armies of the Philistines, and spake according to the same words, and David heard them. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the men, fled from him, and were sore afraid. And the men of Israel said, Have ye seen this man that is come up? Surely to defy Israel is he come up. And it shall be that the man who killeth him, the king will enrich him with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel. No, in other words, no taxes. And David spake to the men that stood by him, saying, What shall be done to the man that killeth this Philistine, and taketh away the reproach from Israel? Now listen to his response. That's not his motivation. But here's what he says. For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God? I think I understand what David is saying is not so much for himself, what shall be done? I think he is saying, you mean if somebody kills him, this is what they get? And nobody's taken up the opportunity to do this? Why? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine? Who is he? We have God. And that's the difference in David and all of those that were there who were locked up and wouldn't do anything and couldn't see it and couldn't understand that if God be for us, who can be against us? And so David is astonished. And the people answered him after this manner, saying, so shall it be done to the man that killeth him. And Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spake unto the men. And Eliab's anger was kindled against David. And he said, why camest thou down hither? And with whom hast thou left those few sheep in the wilderness? And see the disdain, okay? The talking down. The mentality of, you're nothing. Get them back to dad and go back to that lowly job you have. Why camest thou down hither? And with whom hast thou left the and then he says, I know thy pride. Oh, really? As if he hasn't already expressed pride in showing disdain for his brother David and minimizing the job he did with his father's sheep. He misunderstood David completely. David was only there to do what his father told him to do, to find out how his brothers were, and to bring a care package. He should have said, hey, thank you for coming. And not chided him. But he says, I know thy pride and the naughtiness of thine heart. Oh, really? You can read his heart. For thou art come down that thou mightest see the battle. Really? That's why he came? Just so he could be nosy? No. He came down because he was an obedient son. For thou art come down that thou mightest see the battle. And David said, what have I done? What have I done wrong? I am here because Dad sent me. I am here to bring something to you. I've not done anything. You're wrong, brother. Your assessment of me is not correct. You don't know my heart. You don't know why I'm here. And then he makes this statement. He asks the question, is there not a cause? There's a reason I'm here, and it's bigger than me, and it's bigger than you. Because David knew there were no coincidences. And things are starting to unfold, and David is starting to recognize and understand why he's there. He's there long enough to assess the battle. He can see what has unfolded. And 40 days of nothing. And then he begins to reveal who he is and why God chose him and what God was going to do with his life. In verse 30, and he turned from him toward another. So he turns away from his brother, he ignores what he says, and he begins to talk and ask questions. He spake after the same manner, asking again, why? Who's this Philistine? Why is nobody doing anything? And the people answered him again after the former manner. And when the words were heard which David spake, they rehearsed them before Saul, and he sent for him. Did Saul know David? Yes. Remember, what was he? He was the armor bearer. And what did he do? When Saul was having a bad day, he was playing the harp and soothing his spirit. So Saul knew exactly who this young man was, and he loved this young man. So he comes into the presence of Saul. And the Bible says, Saul said to David, actually, let's go up. It says, and when the words were heard which David spake, they rehearsed them before Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Thy servant will go and fight with this Philistine. In other words, he is saying to Saul, he's no slouch now. Remember, he's the armor bearer. He has been commissioned to go to battle. And so he says, don't worry, and tell the people not to worry. I'll go fight him. And Saul is in his heart saying, sure. Sure you will. Hey, thanks for playing, or thanks for your participation, but you can't do this. He minimized him. He wrote him off and said, you can't do this. You're not capable of doing this. You know, God doesn't need as much our capability as he does faith. He wants to know, can he use us to do things that are beyond us? That's what he's looking for. He's looking for somebody to believe him and the platform that he works from, that when man ends, God begins. And so David, in this conversation, assures Saul that he is willing to do this. And so, verse 32, David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail, and because of him, thy servant will go and fight with this Philistine. And Saul said to David, thou art not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for thou art but a youth, and he a man of war from his youth. And David said unto Saul, and let's look at this carefully, thy servant kept his father's sheep. Remember, it's a nothing job, okay? Anybody could do it. And there came a lion and a bear, and took a lamb out of the flock, and I went after him. Who in his right mind would do that? Only a young man who had a trust and a faith in God, that God could do things beyond him. He went after the bear. You would think, okay, it's just the lamb, count our losses, I'll just tell Dad in the morning. No! David believed God enough that he went after the lion, he went after the bear, and obviously these are on separate occasions, and he killed them. He says, and took a lamb out of the flock, and I went after him and smote him and delivered it out of his mouth. And when he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and smote him and slew him. Thy servant slew both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing he hath defied the armies of the living God. How tall can bears stand? Grizzlies can be almost 12 feet. Now, what we don't realize is that Goliath was smaller than most bears, even as big as he was and as tall as he was. And Goliath was not any more fearful or dangerous than a lion. A lion can crunch bones with its teeth like nothing. And so, from man's perspective, you would look at David as Saul, and you would write him off and say, he's crazy. There's no way. It's impossible. Yes, exactly. It was impossible. All things are possible to him that believeth. With God, all things are possible, but with man, nothing is possible. But with God, all things are possible. And so David understood this. He knew even as a young man that this is who God was and this is what God could do. And David is not afraid. You say, well, I bet when he saw him and he got out there, he was afraid. Well, just hang on. Saul decides he's going to help David. And here's the problem, folks. When you equip men with men's ideas, and you equip men with their equipment, if you will, it changes the game. Saul says, okay, if you're going to go, I'll give you my armor. David puts it on, and Saul was head and shoulders over all of Israel, and it's like this. And David says, I haven't proved this. What was he saying? This is not how God has used me. So I can't take your method, your gear, and go to battle. I have to do this how I know God can work through me and do it through me and nobody else. And this is why when we find a cause and God gives us a cause, we have to do it with the understanding and the direction that He's leading me rather than anybody else. God was using this man in a way, this young man in a way, and Saul is probably absolutely baffled by this and the courage of this young man, but still in his heart has reservations that this is not going to go well. And maybe the reason he asked for him to use the armor, and maybe the discouraging words, is Saul was very much about himself. And the onus was upon him. If he sent him out there, what's his dad going to say? And what are the men going to say? And what are the Philistines? How much more are they going to? What are they going to say when they send out this young man out there and they begin to scoff and laugh? When Goliath looked at David, he was insulted. He said, "What am I, a dead dog?" And he basically says to David, "Come here and let me feed you to the birds. I'm going to rip you from limb to limb, and I'm going to leave you dead here in the field and let the birds come and eat you." But it didn't happen that way. That's found in verses 43 and 44. Verse 45 says, "Then said David to the Philistine, Thou comest to me with a sword and with a spear and with a shield. But I am come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied." You know what he left out? His slingshot. David wasn't trusting in his slingshot. He was trusting in his God. There's a big difference. And you would think that he would have reservation. But it says in verse 46, "This day will the Lord deliver thee into mine hand, and I will smite thee and take thine head from thee, and I will give the carcasses of the host of the Philistines this day unto the fowls of the air, and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And all this assembly shall know that the Lord saveth not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands." And it came to pass, when the Philistine arose and came and drew nigh to meet David, that David hasted and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. So David was so confident in God, he didn't waste any time. He grabbed those 5 smooth stones, put them in his pouch, and went towards the giant. And all he had to throw is one stone. And it was over. He stood there, it went right in his forehead, and down he went, and it was over. This is like a few minutes, just less than about a 30-second knockout in a fight. And everybody's just standing around. What? What just happened? And then David follows through. He cuts off his head with his sword, holds it up, and the enemies of Israel, the Philistines, ran for their lives. But guess what? It wasn't about his self-glory. David didn't make the song, David has slain his thousands, and Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. That was really the beginning of Saul going after David. That wasn't created by David. That was the community, the nation of Israel. David was saying, God's going to do this. I may be an instrument, but God's going to do this. And I'm going to do this and this and this because He allows me to. So, the cause of the Lord is great. Find that cause for you. Find what God, the reason why you're here. The reason, I'm not talking about just here, the reason you are on this planet. What better cause than growing a church? What better cause than giving the gospel? What better cause than reaching this community, reaching this state, reaching our nation for the Lord Jesus Christ? The cause is great. The dangers are imposing. And you may look at yourself, or you may think of yourself, or look at others and say, there's no way. But God has a totally different perspective of you and of me as a child of God. If God be for us, who can be against us? Let's stand, our heads are bowed, our eyes are closed. I'm going to ask my wife